South Carolina, 1739. The summer heat clung to everything like a fever that would not break. The rice plantations along the Stono River shimmered under the white glare of the sun, each one a kingdom with its own set of rules and its own kind of cruelty. The sound of insects filled the air, but beneath it, beneath the noise of life going on as usual, there was something else, a tension, a quiet that wasn't peace but the moment before thunder. In St. Paul's Parish, 20 miles southwest of Charlestown, the enslaved outnumbered their masters by 10 to 1. They worked knee-deep in the mud, tending the rice fields that had made their owners rich beyond reason, men whose names carried more weight than most laws. The wealth of the colony rested on those fields, and the fields rested on the backs of the enslaved, Africans who knew how to make rice grow, because it was their crop long before it was Carolina's fortune. The Hutchinson plantation stretched for miles along the river, its great house perched on a rise of land that overlooked the floodplains. To the planters, it was the perfect spot, a home for watching others work. William Hutchinson had inherited the place from his father and expanded it with ruthless ambition. He'd bought 42 new slaves in 3 years. One of them was listed in his ledger simply as Jemmy. There was no surname, no age, just one word: Angola. The ink was fading, but the meaning was clear. He was another acquisition, another strong back, another set of hands to break. But the people in the quarters knew something Hutchinson did not. They knew Jemmy spoke 4 languages. They knew he could read and write Portuguese, and that he hid it carefully. They knew that the scars on his back were not marks of submission. They were records of survival. They knew that Jemmy had once been a soldier, maybe even a commander, in the Kingdom of Kongo before Portuguese slavers dragged him into the hold of a ship. The plantations could strip him of his name and family, but not of what he knew. That knowledge, though sleeping, was still alive. Overseer Ezra Cobb ruled the Hutchinson place with the kind of violence that men mistake for strength. The slaves called him Red Devil. He had pale, sunburned skin and a temper that flared like dry straw. He carried a bullhide whip that had tasted too many backs. Cobb's favorite sport was to find fault. Any fault would do, and make an example of it. A wrong glance, a few seconds of rest, a word spoken in a native tongue, all could bring punishment. In 8 months, Jemmy had been whipped 4 times, once for looking at Hutchinson's wife, once for speaking Congo to another man, once for pausing to drink water, once for no reason at all. Cobb's idea of authority was to make other men tremble. But during that last whipping, something changed. Jemmy didn't scream. He didn't cry out. He just clenched his jaw until blood ran from the corner of his mouth, then stood up afterward, wiped the blood away, and went back to work. That night the plantation was silent, but something new had begun breathing in the dark. In the following nights, Jemmy started talking, but not to everyone and not all at once. He spoke quietly, choosing his words like a man setting traps. To some he spoke in Congo, to others Portuguese, to a few broken English. He learned who could be trusted, who had once been a warrior, who knew how to track, how to mend iron, who knew the swamps better than the overseers. He learned which patrols rode which roads and when, which plantations had guns in the house, and which overseers were cruel enough to deserve to die first. He didn't speak of rebellion directly, not yet. He just asked questions and listened, and the more he listened, the more he understood that he was not alone. There were others who had seen enough of the whip, who'd lost children and wives, who'd been broken and sold so many times they'd stopped counting. Kaito from the Gold Coast, whose son had been taken north to Virginia. Monday, the man with 3 toes missing from a failed escape. Solomon, who could still write Arabic prayers in the dirt with a stick. Quash, only 20, born free in Benin before raiders captured him. These men carried memories like hidden weapons. They were waiting for someone to tell them when. By early September, the Low Country was a tinderbox. War had broken out between Britain and Spain, and Spanish Florida, only 100 miles south, had declared itself a refuge for escaped slaves. If you could reach St. Augustine, the Spanish would grant you freedom and land. The promise was enough to turn rumor into hope, and hope into danger. The colonial government tightened its grip. Extra patrols, new punishments, public hangings for anyone caught trying to run. It only made the silence heavier. The fields seemed to hold their breath. Sunday, September 9th. A Sabbath morning, hot and bright. The masters dressed in their best coats and rode off to church. They left their plantations in the hands of the very people they feared most, trusting routine and religion to keep order. On the Hutchinson property, Jemmy rose before dawn. He did not eat. In Kongo, warriors fasted before battle, and though he had been forced to abandon much, he would not abandon that. He walked to the edge of the plantation, where a live oak marked the boundary. 6 men were waiting. They had come through the darkness from neighboring lands, slipping between patrols and dogs. No one spoke. Jemmy nodded, and they began to move. Their first stop was the tool house. The door was locked, but Monday had stolen the key 3 days earlier, while Cobb was busy yelling at a driver. Inside were axes, hoes, and a single rusted sword that had once belonged to William Hutchinson's grandfather, a decoration more than a weapon. Jemmy took it and felt its balance. It was old, but it was still a sword. The others armed themselves with what they could find. These were farmers, not soldiers, but under Jemmy's calm gaze they straightened their backs. They would become soldiers again before the morning ended. The front door of the big house stood open. No one locked doors when they believed themselves safe. The attack began before the sun cleared the trees. Cobb died first, cut down by Jemmy's blade before he could draw a breath. William Hutchinson fell next, reaching for a pistol he never managed to fire. His wife screamed once before Phoebe silenced her. The 2 sons were found upstairs later by militiamen who refused to describe the scene. And then Jemmy did something that froze the blood of everyone who later saw it. He took Cobb's axe, the same one that had beaten so many, and severed the overseer's head. Then Hutchinson's. He placed both on fence posts at the entrance to the plantation, facing the road. For decades, the planters had displayed the heads of executed slaves as warnings. Now the message was reversed. The plantation system had taught terror. Jemmy simply gave it back. By mid-morning, the rebellion had begun to spread like fire in dry grass. They moved south from plantation to plantation, killing masters known for cruelty, freeing the enslaved, gathering weapons. Drums and horns carried the call. At each stop more joined, some from rage, some from fear, some because they saw a door opening that had been closed their entire lives. At the Godfrey plantation, 12 men joined. At the Wallace place, 8 more. They were heading for Spanish Florida and freedom. They sang as they marched, calling out liberty in the languages they still remembered. They took guns from a store, rum from another. The rum was a mistake, but at that moment, the taste of it must have felt like victory. Lieutenant Governor William Bull was riding that same road on his way home from church when he saw them. Dozens of armed Africans, drums beating, banners raised. He wheeled his horse and fled into the woods, galloping for Willtown. Within hours, the church bells were ringing alarms across the parishes. The militia gathered. Riders spread the word. The slaves have risen. In Willtown, the local captain called every able man to arms. By the time they were ready to ride, the sun was high and Jemmy's column had traveled 10 miles. Near the Edisto River, at a place called Jacksonboro, they stopped. Some wanted to keep going, to cover more ground before the militia could catch up. Others said they needed rest, to eat, to breathe. The air shimmered with heat. They were exhausted, half-drunk and proud. Jemmy decided to stop. It was the first mistake he'd made. He didn't understand how quickly the Colonial network could move, how fast men on horseback could close the distance. He didn't know that bells were still ringing, and riders were already coming. The rest of that day would end in smoke and blood, in musket fire and chaos, in bodies left to rot along the road. But before that happened, before the riverbank turned red, the rebellion had already accomplished something the colony would never undo. It had proven that the enslaved were not broken. It had shown that the plantations, for all their power, were built on fear, and fear could be turned back against them. The masters would rebuild their houses, strengthen their laws, dig deeper graves for those who resisted. But no law could erase the fact that for one Sabbath morning, the people the colony called property had risen as soldiers. For a few hours they were free. The rebellion would end that evening, but the story of what began beneath that live oak would not die. It would travel from mouth to mouth, from field to field, from generation to generation. It would survive in the songs and the whispers, long after the last of the blood had dried. And the name they gave it, long before it entered the history books, was not the Stono Rebellion. They called it the morning Jimmy remembered who he was. The sun climbed higher over the Carolina low country, lighting a landscape that seemed, for the first time in memory, beyond the control of its masters. Smoke from burning outbuildings curled above the tree line. Dogs barked miles apart and then fell silent. The Stono River ran slow and brown beside the road that would soon be written into legend. Along that road, men and women walked with the cautious disbelief of people who had lived too long without choices. They carried hoes and hatchets, muskets stolen from plantation gun racks, and a handful of precious swords. Some had never known freedom. Some had forgotten how it felt. All of them now marched south behind a man who was still learning to believe in the thing he had begun. Jimmy walked at the front, the rusted sword in his hand catching flashes of sun. He had spoken little since they left the Hutchinson plantation. Around him were men he had chosen, and men who had simply joined, drawn by the roar of something greater than themselves. Behind them the road filled with others, women carrying children, the old moving slower but refusing to stay behind. The smell of rice smoke and blood followed them. Somewhere ahead, past the swamps and the soldiers' checkpoints, lay Spanish Florida and the promise of a life where no man could own another. They moved in silence at first, then someone began to beat a drum. The sound was low and steady like a heartbeat. Others picked it up, tapping rhythms on iron pots, on the stocks of muskets, on the wooden handles of their tools. Soon the air was alive with rhythm. The planters had banned drums years before, fearing they could carry messages farther than words. Now those same rhythms were carrying a different message, one of defiance, one of freedom. The sound rolled across the fields, through the cypress and pine, and every slave within earshot stopped what they were doing and listened. The plantations that had been quiet for centuries began to stir. At the Godfrey plantation, 12 more men joined. They came running through the rice fields barefoot, carrying nothing but the clothes on their backs and anger in their chests. At the Wallace place, 8 more appeared, bringing with them a handful of muskets taken from their master's cabinet. By the time they reached the Lemley plantation, known for its cruelty, the group had nearly doubled. They struck fast and hard as Jimmy had taught them. No speeches, no mercy. The Lemley house went up in flames, the master and his sons lying where they had fallen. Jimmy did not stop to watch the fire. He knew time was against them. Further down the road, they found a general store run by a man named Sacheverell. The shop was a trove of forbidden things, powder, muskets, rum. They took it all. The rum was their second mistake. Some drank deeply, celebrating the victory, the impossible sense of being free, even if only for a day. Jimmy tried to stop them, shouting that they would need clear heads for the journey ahead, but his voice was swallowed by laughter, by the sudden reckless joy of people who had lived too long without it. He could not blame them. The rebellion had begun as vengeance, but was becoming something else, a living thing beyond any man's control. By mid-morning, their column stretched half a mile along the river road. From a distance it might have looked like an army, but up close it was chaos, families mixed with fighters, songs blending with prayers, 100 dreams moving south together. They passed through the old settlements of the parish, where every plantation had its own stories of cruelty, its own ghosts. As they walked, more joined. Some had weapons, some had nothing but open hands. For a few hours the world belonged to them. Back in Willtown, Lieutenant Governor William Bull arrived at the militia post, breathless and shaking. His face was streaked with dirt and fear. He had seen something that no white man in Carolina had ever seen, slaves marching with order, carrying banners, shouting liberty. In voices that did not sound broken, he called for a full mobilization. Bells rang out from the church steeple, summoning every able-bodied man to arms. Riders fanned out in every direction. Within hours, the parishes of St. Paul's and St. Andrew's were in a state of panic. Men barricaded their homes. Women loaded muskets. The colony that had thought itself safe was suddenly at war. But on the road, Jimmy's people did not yet know how close the danger was. They were still moving, still gathering strength, still believing the impossible. They stopped only once, near a small bridge that crossed a tributary of the Stono. There Jimmy ordered the bodies of fallen whites to be buried, not out of mercy, but out of calculation. He knew that the faster they moved, the better their chances of reaching Spanish Florida. Every hour mattered, yet each plantation they passed pulled more people into their wake. slowing them down even as their numbers grew. By the time the sun stood high overhead, the march had become both triumph and tragedy in motion. Children walked barefoot beside men who had once been soldiers, women carrying infants alongside men carrying rifles. They sang in Congo, in Mandinka, in broken English. Some wept as they sang, some smiled. For that single stretch of road, it was as if the world had turned upside down, and all the power that had once crushed them had been lifted. They didn't know they were marching towards slaughter. They didn't care. For the first time in their lives, they were walking without chains. At the same hour, miles behind them, the first wave of militia was already riding out from Willtown. 40 men on horseback, armed with muskets and pistols, moving fast. More were coming from neighboring parishes, answering the bell. The hunters had found their scent. The distance between them was shrinking with every mile, but the sound of drums still echoed over the rice fields, and the slaves who heard it whispered to each other in their cabins that something had changed forever. By late afternoon, Jemmy and his followers reached Jacksonboro, a bend in the Edisto River shaded by oaks. They stopped to drink and rest against Jemmy's instincts. The air shimmered with heat. The rum from the storehouse had dulled their edge. Some danced, some prayed, some argued about whether to continue or fortify their position. Jemmy tried to rally them, to remind them of the plan, but exhaustion had turned his words to wind. They had been up since before dawn, fighting and marching without rest. He sat by the river, staring at the sword that had once belonged to a master, now streaked with blood and rust. Around him, laughter faded into sleep. The militia reached them just after 4. What followed would be called the Battle of Stono, though it was less a battle than an execution. It lasted less than an hour, but its echo would carry for centuries. The story of that hour, the smoke, the thunder, the river turning red, belongs to the next chapter, because this chapter ends not with defeat, but with the brief, terrible beauty of defiance. The sight of men and women who had been enslaved their whole lives walking together beneath the Carolina sun, calling out a word their masters said they did not understand: freedom. The afternoon sun burned like judgment over the Carolina marshes. The rice fields shimmered silver-green, and the air trembled with the hum of insects. On the banks of the Edisto River, Jemmy's followers rested beneath the oaks. Some slept in the grass, others cleaned their weapons or washed blood from their hands in the slow brown water. The mood was uneasy. The rum had loosened tongues, and old arguments had started to surface, whether they should keep marching or stay and fight. To most, Spanish Florida felt close enough to touch, 100 miles that might as well have been won. They didn't know that riders had already left Willtown hours earlier, that the militia was closing in fast, guided by smoke and fear. Jemmy sat apart from the others, the sword across his knees. The blade was pitted and dull, but it was still sharp enough. His hands rested on the hilt as though it were an anchor. He had made his decision that morning. Once they started, there was no going back. Yet as he looked around at the faces of the men and women who followed him, he felt the weight of what he'd set in motion. Some of them were barely more than boys. Some carried infants wrapped in cloth. Others were missing fingers, ears, or eyes, marks of punishment from lives spent surviving. They trusted him to lead them to freedom. He knew that most of them would not see the next sunrise. The first gunshot cracked through the stillness like the snapping of a tree branch. Then came another. Then a volley. The air filled with smoke and the dry thunder of muskets. Horses screamed. Men shouted. The camp exploded into chaos. The Carolina militia had arrived, 40 men on horseback armed with pistols, sabers, and muskets. They'd come not to capture, but to kill. The rebellion had terrified the colony's ruling class. They didn't want prisoners or trials. They wanted an example that would make every slave in South Carolina afraid to even whisper the word, freedom. Jemmy shouted for order, his voice rising above the noise. "Form up, hold the line!" He yelled in English and Portuguese, and those who understood began to move. He had trained soldiers before. Even now he could see the ground like a map, where to stand, where to take cover. He pulled the armed men together, forming a rough line along the trees. Those with muskets returned fire, and for a brief moment it worked. The first volley from the rebels dropped 2 militia riders from their saddles. The others hesitated, startled by the precision of the response. These were not panicked field hands. They were fighting like soldiers. For 5 minutes, maybe less, the battle teetered on a knife's edge. Jemmy shouted orders in 3 languages, rallying men who had never fought side by side before. Smoke burned their eyes. The sharp reek of gunpowder mixed with the heavy scent of the swamp. When their ammunition ran out, they swung axes and pitchforks. They fought with the desperation of people who had already died once and refused to die again. But the militia had numbers, discipline, and fresh powder. When the second wave arrived, 30 more men from neighboring parishes, the balance broke. The rebels fell back toward the river. Horses crashed through the underbrush, musket balls tearing through trees and flesh alike. Men stumbled and fell. Women grabbed children and ran into the cypress shadows. Some tried to swim across the river and drowned in the current. Others turned to fight and were cut down where they stood. The line dissolved. What had begun as a march of defiance became a slaughter. Jemmy stood his ground near the riverbank. His shirt was torn and bloodied, his face streaked with sweat and dirt. He could have run. No one would have blamed him, but he didn't. He reloaded the pistol he'd taken from Hutchinson's desk and fired until the powder was gone. Then he drew the sword. When the militia charged, he met them head-on. Witnesses later claimed that he killed 6 men before the shot that struck his chest. They said he fought like a man possessed, like someone who had seen death too many times to fear it anymore. When the smoke cleared, the river ran red. Bodies lay scattered among the reeds, men, women, and children. The surviving rebels were dragged from the woods, their hands bound, their faces blank. Some begged for mercy in languages the militia couldn't understand. Most said nothing. Jemmy lay near the water's edge, his breath shallow, the sword still in his hand. A militiaman stood over him, musket smoking. "He's still alive," someone said. "Finish it," said another. But one of them, no one remembered his name, leaned down instead. He spoke in Portuguese, a language few there could recognize. What he said is lost. Except for one thing the survivors never forgot. The man asked, "Who are you?" Jemmy smiled through blood and answered, "I am the one you could not break." Then he died. The militia decapitated the dead, lining their heads on posts along the road as a warning. Jemmy's head was placed first. The rest were left where they fell, the bodies unburied for days in the Carolina sun. Those captured alive were executed in Charlestown within a week. The rebellion, they declared, was crushed, order restored. But the truth was more complicated. For though the rebellion had failed, the idea behind it could not be executed. The militia rode back through the plantations, and the planters slept a little easier that night, but not much. They had seen what they were never supposed to see: organization, courage, defiance. The system they'd built to keep people silent had produced men who could command armies. In the weeks that followed, rumors began to spread like seeds in the wind. Some said Jemmy's body was never found. Others said his head vanished from its post days after the display. Some whispered that he had survived the battle and escaped to Spanish Florida, that he lived among the Maroons in the swamps, training new warriors in the art of resistance. The authorities called it nonsense, but they doubled the patrols anyway. The truth was buried under fear and the smell of decay, but the memory could not be killed. Along the river road, slaves still walked past the places where their brothers had fallen, and whispered his name. They did not call him Jemmy anymore. They called him the soldier who remembered. And even as the planters rebuilt their burned homes and strengthened their laws, they could not silence the one thing they feared most: the sound of drums echoing faintly in the distance, reminding them that the rebellion might be over. But the fire was not. The smoke of battle hung over the Carolina swamps for days. The sun rose and set over a land that smelled of blood, powder, and wet earth. The Stono River carried the bodies away in silence, rolling them toward the sea, as if to hide what the land could no longer bear to look at. For the planters and militia, the rebellion had ended in triumph. For the enslaved, it had only changed shape. The men and women who survived the Battle of Stono disappeared into the wilderness, hunted by bloodhounds and soldiers. Some were captured within days. Others vanished into the marshes, never seen again. And yet, even among those who had not fought, something had changed. In the following weeks, the countryside became a place of fear. Every plantation doubled its patrols. Bells were installed on the porches of big houses, ready to sound alarms at the first hint of unrest. New laws were written before the bodies in the fields had finished rotting. The planters wanted order restored, not just in the land, but in memory. What had happened on September 9, 1739, had to become a warning, not an example. But warnings have a way of turning into legends. The colonial records list the rebellion as crushed. 40 slaves killed in battle, 23 white colonists dead, 13 rebels executed publicly in Charlestown. That should have been the end of it. Yet plantation records from the months that followed tell a quieter, stranger story. In parish after parish, slave inventories became inconsistent. Names vanished from ledgers. Property lists showed fewer workers than before. Some planters claimed deaths that were never verified. Others said their slaves had run off, even when no tracks were found. The numbers didn't add up. At least 20 men and women from the Stono plantations were simply gone. Too many to have been killed in the fighting. Too many to have been overlooked. Search parties scoured the swamps for weeks, their torches glowing like fireflies in the night. They found remnants, footprints, bits of fabric, broken tools, but never the people themselves. Some said the survivors had fled south, reaching Spanish Florida. Others believed they were hiding closer, in the tangled heart of the low country itself, in the places no white man dared to go. And then came the stories. 3 weeks after the battle, a planter named Robert Pringle wrote to his cousin in Charlestown about an unsettling discovery. One of his slaves had hanged himself in his cabin. Carved into the wooden wall beside the body were words in a language no one could read. A visiting Portuguese merchant was asked to translate. He went pale after a single glance and refused to repeat what he'd read, saying only that the inscription was a military oath from Africa. Pringle burned the cabin to the ground that night. 2 months later, an overseer on the Drayton plantation vanished while crossing the Stono River. His horse returned to the stable without him, bridle torn and wet. The slaves claimed to know nothing, but a patrol found small offerings near a tree on the riverbank, bowls of rice, bits of tobacco, carved wooden figures. The plantation owners dismissed it as heathen nonsense, but the rumors spread. There was another mystery that no one could explain. The colonial government had ordered the heads of the executed rebels to remain displayed along the Stono River Road indefinitely. They were meant to serve as reminders of what happened to those who defied their masters. But one by one the heads began to disappear. Not all at once, slowly, carefully. The guards who tended the grisly display swore that the heads were being removed at night, not by animals or weather, but by human hands. There were no tracks, no witnesses, only empty posts by the roadside. The first head to vanish was Jimmy's. No one saw it happen. One morning it was simply gone. Some said the Spanish had sent agents to retrieve it, to turn it into a relic of rebellion. Others whispered that Jimmy's followers were coming back, taking the heads to bury them properly, according to old traditions. A few, too frightened to speak loudly, said something else, that Jimmy had not died at all, that the head on that post had never been his. The rumors grew like weeds. By winter, the entire low country was trapped in a kind of quiet hysteria. Patrols reported strange sounds in the night, drums in the distance, fires glimpsed through the trees, chanting carried on the wind. Each plantation blamed the next. Lieutenant Governor William Bull personally took charge of the investigation, demanding order where there was none. He interviewed captured rebels, overseers, and anyone who might know how the uprising had spread so far so fast. The testimonies frightened him more than the rebellion itself. The captured men spoke of meetings held long before the uprising, of messages passed between plantations through songs and carvings, through bits of cloth and bundles of sticks. They spoke of a man who had told them that freedom would not come in their lifetime, but that they must still fight for it. They said his name was Jemmy. Others called him something older, a name no one wrote down. Bull tortured one man, Caesar, until he spoke. Caesar's words were brief but unforgettable. Jimmy didn't start this. He finished what was already begun. The statement was copied into Bull's report, though no one understood it. What had begun before Jimmy? How far back did this go? There were whispers among the oldest Africans that their people had been waiting for a sign for nearly a century, that each generation passed down the memory of a promise. When the drums called, they would rise. Bull never found proof of this, but he also never forgot it. In private letters he wrote that the Negroes are linked by secret correspondences we cannot perceive, and that if another man like Jimmy were to appear, the whole province might be lost. To prevent that, the Colonial Assembly passed a new law in 1740, the Security Act. It forbade slaves from gathering without white supervision, banned the use of drums, and made it illegal to teach any enslaved person to read or write. The act even required masters to report any slave who showed unusual intelligence or military bearing. Such men were to be sold out of the colony immediately. The law didn't mention Jemmy by name, but everyone knew it was written for him. Still, the planters could not stop what had already begun to spread. Not open rebellion, but something quieter, harder to kill. The slaves had seen what was possible. The white colonists had seen what they feared most. The ground between them would never be the same. And in the fields under the moonlight, when the overseers slept, the people still sang. The words were different now, the rhythms slower, but the meaning was unchanged. It was a song about a man who had once been a soldier, who refused to bow, who died standing on his own land. They said that on still nights, if you listened near the Stono River, you could hear the faint sound of drums drifting through the fog, not loud enough to wake anyone, just enough to remind those who feared them that silence does not mean peace. The rebellion was over, but the memory of it had just begun to breathe. Winter came early to the Carolina Low Country in 1739. The riverbanks froze for the first time in memory, and the wind that blew through the rice fields carried more than cold. It carried fear. The masters sat by their fires with loaded muskets within arm's reach. Patrols rode the roads at night, torches flaring in the darkness, searching for anything that moved. The rebellion, they said, was crushed. The rebels were dead, but the land itself disagreed. Something in the air had changed, something the planters could not name but could feel every time they stepped outside after sunset. The plantations were quiet, too quiet, and the silence felt wrong. It was the kind of silence that listens back. By January 1740, the colony had regained its rhythm on the surface. The Security Act was enforced with merciless precision. Every plantation had to keep armed white men on patrol every Sunday, the day when the Stono Rising had begun. No enslaved person was allowed to gather in groups, not even for prayer without a white overseer present. Drums were outlawed. The penalty for teaching a slave to read or write was a fine so high that even wealthy planters feared to risk it. On paper, order had returned. In the fields and cabins, a different kind of order was taking shape, one the masters would never understand. Lieutenant Governor William Bull had begun to suspect that the rebellion had not truly ended. He was receiving reports, small, strange incidents that seemed unrelated, but all carried the same scent of defiance. A bonfire here, a broken irrigation gate there, rice crops ruined by water that had been released at the wrong time, a field sabotaged with salt. None of it was enough to cripple the plantation system, but together it felt like a whisper of rebellion that refused to die. He wrote to London that the spirit of insurrection seems to move invisibly through the Negro population, as though the very memory of liberty is its own contagion. In late January, Bull got word of a secret gathering discovered by a night patrol near the Drayton Plantation, the same property where an overseer had vanished weeks earlier. The patrol claimed to have found 30 slaves sitting in a circle in the woods around a small fire. At the center was an old man they called Marcus, chanting in a language no one recognized. They arrested him and brought him in for questioning. The others fled into the swamp. Marcus was beaten for 3 days before he finally spoke. What he said would never appear in the official record, but it was written in a private letter from Bull to the governor of Virginia, one of those letters that would not be uncovered until nearly 2 centuries later. Marcus said the gathering was not a rebellion. It was a remembrance. They had been meeting every week since October, not to plan another uprising, but to honor the ones who had died at Stono. He said that Jemmy had known he would die, and that he had told his followers what to do after he was gone. "We are not finished," Marcus told them, "and we are remembering." He said the gatherings were spreading across the Low Country, hundreds of slaves from 5 different parishes taking turns keeping the memory alive. When Bull demanded to know what Jemmy had told them to do, Marcus only said, "He told us to wait until the drums speak again." Marcus died from his injuries 2 days later. The colonial government suppressed every trace of the confession. Bull ordered the execution of every slave caught attending night meetings, but still the gatherings continued. The planters couldn't understand how the slaves were communicating. They had taken away drums, outlawed writing, forbade travel. Yet somehow word still spread, from cabin to cabin, from whisper to whisper. No overseer could find the pattern. The low country began to breathe with a strange rhythm, as if the entire land pulsed to an invisible drumbeat. By summer, the planters had started to notice other signs. Carved symbols appeared on trees near plantation boundaries, circles, crossed lines, and markings that looked like eyes. At first they thought it was childish vandalism. Then they realized the symbols matched those that had been found on the posts where the rebels' heads once stood before they vanished. The militia began cutting down any tree that bore such marks, but the carvings always returned somewhere else. Sometimes a plantation would wake to find a clay bowl of rice or tobacco left at the edge of the field, offerings to something unseen. The ministers tried to interpret these acts as pagan superstition. They preached sermons about the dangers of African witchcraft, urging planters to enforce Christian obedience. But even among the house slaves who sat in the back pews of the churches, something else was happening. They began to blend the psalms they were forced to sing with rhythms from the Old World. The white congregations thought they heard music. What they were hearing was communication. The rebellion that had died in fire and musket smoke was being reborn in memory and rhythm. The people had learned that the price of open war was too high. But they also learned that defiance didn't always need swords. It could live in a song and a secret word, in the deliberate breaking of a tool. It could live in laughter shared quietly in the fields when the overseer's back was turned. It could live in remembering Jimmy's name, even when saying it out loud was forbidden. Bull continued to receive reports that unsettled him. In one, a patrol found a slave woman kneeling beside the river, whispering into the water as if speaking to someone beneath it. When asked what she was doing, she replied, "Feeding the ones who walk under the current." When they beat her for the answer, she said, "He walks with them now. He listens." In another case, a plantation owner swore he saw a line of torches moving through the swamp at midnight, dozens of lights drifting between the trees, vanishing as he approached. He claimed he heard the faint sound of a drum before the darkness swallowed it whole. By the end of 1740, the British Parliament praised the Carolina Assembly for restoring peace. But those who lived there knew better. The peace was brittle, unnatural, built on terror and silence. The planters had made new laws, new patrols, new gallows. Yet none of it stopped the feeling that something unseen was still moving beneath their feet. The rebellion's body was dead, but its ghost was awake. The old people in the quarters began to tell stories about Jimmy, not as a man, but as a spirit of resistance, a soldier who refused to rest. They said that when the wind howled through the rice fields, it was Jimmy's breath passing over the land he had died to claim. And sometimes, in the still hours before dawn, the planters would wake to the faint, impossible sound of drums drifting across the marshes, distant, steady, and patient. They told themselves it was just the wind. But the slaves knew better. They smiled in the dark because they knew what the sound meant. The drums were still speaking, and Jimmy was still listening. The year 1741 opened with fog so thick that the sun over the Carolina coast seemed a rumor. The Stono River glided like a ribbon of dull steel through a landscape that pretended to forget. The masters called it peace. The enslaved called it waiting. The new laws had turned the low country into a prison. Armed riders patrolled every road. Lanterns hung on the porches of plantation houses all night. Overseers carried pistols to Sunday service. Slaves were forbidden to gather, to sing in groups, to travel beyond sight of their quarters. Yet beneath the surface, under the rice and the mud and the sermons, something lived, a rhythm that would not die. The planters had outlawed the drums, but they couldn't outlaw the heartbeats that kept time with memory. In the first months of that year, subtle acts began again. At Middleton Plantation, the water gates to the rice paddies were found opened in the night, flooding and destroying half a season's crop. The overseer blamed negligence. The field hands said nothing. A week later, the same thing happened on the Lone Plantation. 2 weeks after that, the Williams estate lost an entire storage barn to fire. Each event was treated as isolated misfortune, but the pattern was unmistakable. The fire was moving underground. When word reached Lieutenant Governor Bull, he wrote another letter to London. His words trembled between logic and superstition. The Negro population seems to act with one mind, though there is no meeting, no correspondence that I can find. They do not rise again in open war, yet they conspire by silence and coincidence. I begin to fear we are not contending with reason, but with something invisible that moves among them all. The letter was filed away, but copies survived, buried in archives like faint echoes of a mind unraveling. By spring, the faint acts of sabotage had multiplied. Oxen were turned loose from their pens and vanished into the swamp. Tools disappeared from sheds and were later found broken and buried. At one plantation, every watchdog was poisoned in a single night. At another, a shipment of powder meant for the militia was discovered soaked and useless. The white overseers spoke of bad luck. The slaves kept their eyes lowered and their voices quiet, but among themselves they whispered a name they no longer dared to say aloud in front of anyone else. Jimmy. They said Jimmy walked the river now. They said he spoke through the wind that swept across the flooded fields. They said that every act of defiance, every broken gate, every night meeting was part of a single promise, that the rebellion had not failed. It had only changed shape. In June, another plot was uncovered in Charlestown. More than 50 slaves had planned to set fire to the city, kill their masters in the confusion, and escape to Spanish Florida. The plan unraveled when one man betrayed them in exchange for freedom. The conspirators were hanged publicly on the docks. Their bodies swung for days above the harbor, the sun turning them black and hard. The authorities said it was over. But before the execution, one of the condemned looked out at the crowd and smiled. Witnesses said his final words were, "Tell them Jimmy sends his regards." That phrase began to move through the plantations like a secret blessing. Jimmy sends his regards appeared scratched into barn walls, murmured in passing between field hands, carved beneath the handles of tools. It was meaningless to the overseers, but powerful to those who understood. It meant we are still here. It meant we remember. The more the planters tried to stamp it out, the stronger it became. The phrase began to appear even in songs sung during work hours. The white men thought the tunes were cheerful spirituals. They didn't understand the code. When the slaves sang about crossing the river, they meant Stono. When they sang about Freedom Land, they meant the place Jimmy had promised but never reached. In song, the rebellion had become immortal. In 1744, patrols intercepted another small uprising near Willtown. 15 slaves armed with stolen weapons had tried to flee toward the coast. They were captured after a brief skirmish. Their leader, a tall man whose plantation name was Tom but who refused to answer to it, fought until he was cut down. Before he died, he said something that the militia officer recorded in his report. "It was given to me by a ghost." When they searched his body, they found a sword. It was old, rusted, and not of local make. It matched the description of the one that had belonged to Jimmy, the weapon taken from the Hutchinson house on the morning of the rebellion. The officer kept it as a trophy, hanging it over his fireplace. 3 years later, he died suddenly of fever, and the sword vanished. By then, the story had become something larger than history. Slaves whispered that Jimmy's sword could not be destroyed, that it traveled from hand to hand, appearing whenever the time was right. Some said it had been reforged from the metal of chains. Others said it was carried by spirits who delivered it to those brave enough to fight. The white men dismissed these tales as superstition, but their nightmares told them otherwise. Many planters refused to walk the river road alone after dark. Some claimed to see lights in the swamps, faint glows that moved like lanterns and vanished when approached. Dogs refused to go near the place where the first heads had been displayed. The Security Act could silence the living, but not the dead. In the fields, under the heavy air of summer, the enslaved began leaving small offerings at the edges of the rice paddies, handfuls of rice, shells from the river, carved wooden figures. They said these gifts fed the ones who had fought and fallen, that as long as they were remembered, the land itself would never belong to the masters entirely. By the time the decade ended, the rebellion's physical traces had vanished, but the fear it planted had not. Every crack of thunder reminded the planters of musket fire. Every drumbeat at a distant festival sounded like the beginning of another uprising. And the songs kept spreading, soft, steady, carrying a name that could not be written in any ledger. Jimmy had become more than a man, more than a story. He was a rhythm carried in the breath of the enslaved, a pulse beneath the soil, a fire beneath the rice. The rebellion had burned out, but its ashes still glowed. And sometimes, when the wind swept over the Stono River at night, it carried with it the faintest whisper, barely a breath but unmistakable. "Tell them Jimmy sends his regards." By 1747, the Low Country had learned to live in uneasy silence. The plantation owners no longer spoke of the rebellion, at least not in daylight. To mention Jemmy's name was to give shape to a fear they could not defeat. They told themselves the uprising had been an isolated madness, a fever that had broken. But the land did not agree. The air along the Stono River still felt charged, as though the soil itself remembered. At night, the rice fields glimmered under moonlight like mirrors, still waters hiding what the living refused to see. The sword first resurfaced that year in Charlestown, in the possession of Captain Nathaniel Barnwell, the militia officer who had led the pursuit of the last rebels years earlier. He kept it above his fireplace as a trophy. Visitors said the weapon drew the eye, its rusted blade pitted but strangely clean, the handle worn smooth by many hands. Barnwell liked to tell stories about how he had ended the Negro revolt, embellishing the tale each time, describing himself as the man who brought peace back to Carolina. But his wife hated the sword. She swore she could hear it ring faintly at night, like metal struck far away. That summer, yellow fever swept through the city. Barnwell was one of its first victims. His wife, desperate to pay debts, sold off his belongings, including the sword, to a Jewish merchant named Jacob Levy. Levy was a traveler who claimed he was taking the weapon north to Philadelphia for a collector of curiosities. He left Charlestown in September. He was never seen again. 2 years later, in 1749, a plantation owner in Georgia wrote a strange letter to his cousin in South Carolina. He had purchased a new slave from a dealer who specialized in troublesome stock sold out of other colonies. When the man arrived, he brought nothing with him except an old sword wrapped in cloth. The master recognized it at once from the stories. It matched the description of Barnwell's blade exactly. When asked where it came from, the slave smiled and said, "It was already here when I arrived." The master, terrified, ordered the weapon destroyed. He claimed to have melted it down in his forge, but later that same year, plantation hands reported seeing a glow in the fields at night, a light shaped like a blade moving through the fog. The story of the wandering sword began to spread. Some said it reappeared on plantations where new uprisings were being planned, passed secretly from hand to hand as a promise. Others said it was never truly metal at all, that it was a spirit made visible, a piece of the rebellion's soul that refused to rest. The planters dismissed it as slave superstition, yet more than one overseer resigned after hearing footsteps behind him at night and turning to find nothing but the sound of the wind. By 1750, the sword had become legend. The slaves called it the one that remembers. They said it appeared wherever men and women needed courage, wherever a whip cracked too long and too often. Those who touched it were said to dream of the river road and of a man standing against the sun, his chest bloodied, his eyes calm. They woke with the taste of iron in their mouths and the certainty that they were not alone. Rumors reached Charlestown that year about maroon settlements deep in the great dismal swamp to the north, beyond the reach of colonial patrols. They said the fugitives there lived on platforms above the water, fishing and hunting by day and training by night. They said a man led them, tall, scarred, quiet. Some called him the captain, others called him Jemmy. The officials laughed at the idea. The records showed that Jemmy had been killed at the Battle of Stono, his head displayed for months afterward. And yet, no one could ever explain why his head was the first to vanish, or why even years later, the soldiers posted to guard the remaining heads along the road reported that they heard voices in the night, low, steady, speaking in a language none of them understood. One sentry wrote in his journal that he saw figures moving in the mist, carrying lanterns carved from gourds, and that when he called out, they all turned toward him at once. He never stood guard again. As the decade turned, the story of the sword traveled far beyond South Carolina. Traders carried it north into Virginia, west into the swamps of Georgia. Each version changed, but the core never did. A weapon that would not rust, a spirit that would not rest, a name that the masters could not erase. The rebellion had become something else, an inheritance whispered from one generation to the next. When the Moravian missionary Johann Henkel arrived in South Carolina in 1752, he had no idea what he was stepping into. He came to preach salvation to the enslaved, believing their souls could be redeemed. But he was a careful man, one who listened more than he spoke, and in listening he began to hear a different gospel entirely. In his journals, hidden for more than a century, he wrote of slaves who told stories of the Day of Blood, of a warrior who died but still walked in dreams. Henkel said the stories were told not as folklore but as fact. They speak of him, he wrote, as if he has merely gone to another place and will return when the time is ripe. One night in 1753, Henkel was invited to a slave gathering, approved by the master as a harvest celebration. He described singing and dancing, drums played softly on hollow logs, and movements that looked to him like a kind of ritual. The white overseers thought it was entertainment. Henkel saw something else, formations that resembled military drills, songs that repeated words he could not translate. "This is not play," he wrote. "It is remembrance disguised as joy. I believe they are keeping alive the story of their rebellion through rhythm and motion." When he left the colony, Henkel's faith was shaken. He wrote, "These people worship not in defiance of God, but in defiance of forgetting." He never spoke publicly of what he saw, but his journals would one day become some of the most important records of how the enslaved turned memory into resistance. By the middle of the century, the physical marks of the Stono Rebellion were gone. The rice fields had been replanted, the burned houses rebuilt. The posts where the heads had hung were overgrown with moss, but the masters could not rebuild their sense of safety. They had seen what the enslaved were capable of when unity replaced fear, and still, when storms rolled in from the sea and lightning flashed over the flooded paddies, some swore they saw reflections that did not belong to this world, a line of figures walking through the rain, a sword glinting briefly before vanishing into the mist. The rebellion had ended 16 years before, but its shadow still walked the river road. By the middle of the 18th century, the rebellion at Stono had already been pushed to the margins of official memory. The planters no longer spoke its name, and when they did, they used it only as a warning to newcomers, proof, they said, of the danger of leniency. The Security Act had tightened its grip so completely that the plantation system seemed invincible again. But the land remembered, and so did the people who worked it. The old generation, those who had seen the fires, heard the drums or lost their kin at the river, began to die out. But before they went, they told stories. They told them to children huddled in cabins after dark, to the young who were born into chains, but carried rebellion in their blood. They spoke of Jemmy, the soldier from Kongo who refused to kneel. They said he had fought until the last breath left his body, that he had looked his killers in the eye and said, "I am the one you could not break." They told their children that the river took his body, but not his spirit. By the 1760s, the story had changed its shape again. Carried far from South Carolina by the trade in human lives, slaves sold north to Virginia or west to Georgia brought the tale with them. It moved through plantations like a hidden current, passed from mouth to mouth in whispers and work songs. In Virginia, they called the rebel the captain. In Georgia, he became the one who walks. In the Carolinas, he was simply Jemmy, but the name no longer meant a man, it meant defiance itself. A plantation owner once wrote in his diary that his slaves seemed to hum strange tunes while they work, songs that make no sense in English. He didn't understand that those songs were codes, that the verses he thought were about harvest and heaven were about memory and vengeance. In one song they sang, "Down the road the river bends and past the field where the fire ends. The master sleeps but the wind still knows. The soldier walks where the rice still grows." By then, generations had passed since the rebellion. Yet the planters still built their houses like fortresses, fewer windows, thicker walls, bolts on every door. They had forgotten why, but the architecture remembered the fear. Every hinge, every lock, every barred window was an echo of that single September morning when the masters realized they were not gods, but men. In the 1750s, the Moravian missionary Johann Henkel's journals began circulating quietly among abolitionists in Europe. In them he described the songs, the dances, and the whispered stories of the enslaved. He wrote that the rebellion has not ended. It has entered their prayers. Those journals would later inspire abolitionist scholars who argued that the history of slavery was not only one of submission, but of constant invisible resistance. Still, the official record in South Carolina stayed silent. The rebellion was mentioned only in legislative documents, reduced to a paragraph. A slave insurrection suppressed near Stono River, 1739. Nothing about the heads on posts. Nothing about the sword. Nothing about the law that banned drums and books. Nothing about the nights when patrolmen heard the sound of singing in languages older than the colony itself, and yet the silence could not hold. In 1822, when Denmark Vesey was arrested in Charleston for planning a massive slave uprising, the authorities found in his home several pages written in careful script describing the war at Stono. Vesey had been born in the Caribbean and had never seen the Carolina fields, yet he knew the story. He called Jemmy the first general. During his interrogation, he told his captors that rebellion was not a single event, but a chain that keeps forging itself again. The connection terrified the planters. They burned Vesey's notes and buried his body, but they could not stop the chain. A few years later, in Virginia, a preacher named Nat Turner led another uprising. When questioned, he too spoke of visions, of warriors in the sky, of drums that beat without hands. History calls such things coincidence. But the songs that the slaves sang during Turner's rebellion contained verses that had been sung in Carolina nearly a century before. And so, the story lived on, not in books or monuments, but in the flesh and memory of the people. The descendants of those who fought at Stono carried it through the centuries. In 1937, nearly 200 years after the uprising, a woman named Sarah Washington, born on a former plantation near Charleston, was interviewed by writers from the Federal Writers Project. She was in her 90s. When they asked if she had heard of the Stono Rebellion, she nodded. "My grandmama told me," she said. "Said there was a man once who wouldn't bow to no whip. They killed him, but he ain't stay dead. Said every time the wind moves through the rice, that's him breathing. Said he waiting for folks to wake up again." Those words were written down, tucked into an archive. Most people who read them thought she was speaking in parable. But in the Low Country, among those who still tend the fields, the story of Jemmy is not parable, it is inheritance. Today, the site of the rebellion is unmarked by graves. A metal plaque beside a busy road is all that acknowledges it. The river still winds through the same marshes, the factories and warehouses that now stand where the rice once grew hum, with machines instead of cicadas. But when the fog settles over the water at dusk, it is said that you can still hear something faint. A rhythm buried beneath the hum of traffic, something older than the colony, older than the country itself. Not drums exactly, more like heartbeats. Slow, steady, patient, a reminder that freedom has a memory, and memory never dies. And when the wind passes over the water, those who still listen carefully swear they can hear a whisper carried through the reeds, soft, defiant and eternal. Tell them Jemmy sends his regards. Time has a way of softening what it cannot erase. The plantations of the Carolina Low Country rotted into memory, their fields now overgrown or paved beneath the wheels of commerce. The rice no longer grows by the Stono River, but when the fog rolls in thick and grey, it seems to remember the screams, the hymns, the drums that once echoed through it. On certain mornings the air itself feels older, heavier, as if the earth beneath still carries the pulse of the men and women who refuse to die quietly. The historians say the rebellion failed. They write of the 23 dead colonists, of the militia's swift and merciless retaliation, of the laws that followed, the banning of literacy, the forbidding of drums, the careful surveillance of every movement, every breath of the enslaved. They call it suppression. They call it order restored. But if you listen closely, beneath the polished words of archives and ledgers, you can still hear something else, the sound of defiance that refused to vanish. For Jemmy's war was not only a fight for freedom, it was a fight for remembrance. The men who stood with him that September morning didn't march toward Florida because they believed they would survive. They marched because they wanted the world to know that they had existed, that they were soldiers, not shadows, that they could die standing instead of living bowed. The colonial masters thought death would silence them. Instead, it gave them voice. Across the next century, their story slipped through every crack the system tried to seal. It traveled by word of mouth, by song, by rhythm. Mothers sang it to their children as lullabies. Field hands hummed it in the heat. Preachers disguised it in sermons. And when the overseers listened, they heard only music, never realizing that every verse was a weapon, every harmony a form of rebellion. Each generation found new ways to keep the fire alive. Denmark Vesey whispered it in Charleston. Nat Turner dreamed it in Virginia. Even those who never knew Jimmy's name carried his spirit, as if rebellion itself were a seed that the masters could burn but never kill. The soil kept it hidden, waiting for rain, and when the rains came, so did the memory. By the time the Civil War tore through the South, the ghosts of Stono had been waiting for more than a century. They waited through the lashes, through the chains, through the generations that forgot their faces but never their will. They waited until the day the cannons roared and the flags changed, until men marched not for masters but for meaning. Freedom came slowly, imperfectly, with scars and blood and fire, but it came, and yet even then the story of Jimmy remained buried. The official histories spoke of revolutions, constitutions, and presidents, but not of the man who began it all with nothing but a stolen sword and the courage to believe he was still a man. The rebellion of 1739 was remembered in footnotes, its leader unnamed, its cause diluted into statistics. But among the descendants of the enslaved, the legend endured not as history, but as heartbeat. In the 1930s, when federal writers interviewed former slaves, they recorded fragments of songs and stories that no textbook had preserved. In one, an elderly man said, "My granddaddy told me about the soldier down by the river. Said they cut his head, but he's still walking. Said he waiting till folks get brave again." No scholar could prove the story true. No record could confirm it. But sometimes truth lives in memory, not in ink. Today, if you drive down the quiet back roads of South Carolina, past the factories and the warehouses where the plantations once stood, you'll find a small metal marker beside a ditch that was once a riverbank. It says only, Stono Rebellion, site of the largest slave uprising in the British mainland colonies, September 9th, 1739. Nothing more. No names, no faces, no mention of Jimmy. But if you stand there at dusk, when the last light fades and the world turns the color of ash, you might hear it, the faint whisper of wind through the grass, the rustle of something unseen moving through the reeds. Some say it's just the river breathing. Others know better, because sometimes the air grows heavy, and you can almost hear the rhythm of drums buried under centuries of silence. And if you stay very still, you might hear a voice, not loud but clear, carried through time like a promise that never died. A voice that says, "I am the one you could not break," and then, softer, almost a breath, "Tell them Jimmy sends his regards." The wind carries it down the Stono River, across the forgotten graves and the old rice fields, into the night that never fully ends. The rebellion is over. But the memory is not, because some men die once, and others keep fighting through every story that dares to remember their names.